we'll begin with a quick overview of how this project came to be from our partners at the Canadian Women's Foundation. You'll then hear from the wonderful consultants who created the toolkit. So they'll talk about how it was developed and provide an overview of it. And then we'll also provide a walkthrough of the website's platform where you can access the toolkit, as well as some commentary from the consultants and partners on this project about the different pieces of the toolkit. And then finally, at the end, you'll have an opportunity to ask questions about the toolkit, and we've set some time aside just for that. So that's the plan for today, and then we'll wrap up. And just a note, because we have so many folks on the call with us today, we've already mentioned that what we'll do is we'll compile all the questions. So if we don't get to all the questions, we will take those back, provide some written responses, and send those out to you through a follow-up email. All right. So since this is a public event, I'm just going to give you a quick overview about our organization. If this is your first time hearing about us, the Canadian Centre for Safer Communities is a national not-for-profit organization that operates as a community of practice with a membership representing over 100 communities across Canada. Our vision is communities where people are safe and feel safe, and we aim to achieve this by working with rural, urban, Indigenous communities of all sizes to promote safety and well-being through collaboration, capacity strengthening, and knowledge exchange. And we also offer a broad range of services, including strategic planning, research, mentoring, resource development, and knowledge mobilization, so events like this. And you can learn more about us at our website. So it's on the slide, but we'll also share it in the chat and in the follow-up email. And so in terms of this partnership with the Canadian Women's Foundation, I think Karen's going to speak to this a little bit more, but we wanted to note too that we had connected with them several years ago through a project exploring the relationship between climate change, violence, and community safety. And through ongoing conversations, we identified that there was a lot of overlap in the work that both of our organizations do. So one example being the way extreme weather and other events disproportionately impact various groups in the communities, including women. And the need to really address this disparity. And so I believe Karen, like I said, will speak further to this, but the alignment between the two organizations really brought us together. And we are really excited to partner with them on this project when the opportunity was presented by Public Safety Canada. And they also just became a member of CCFSC. So we look forward to continuing to strengthen the partnership and working with them moving forward. So with that, I'll turn things over to you, Karen. So please, everyone, welcome Karen Campbell, the Vice President of Community Initiatives at the Canadian Women's Foundation.
Thank you very much, Katie, and welcome everybody. It is really wonderful to see so many people online with us this afternoon. As Katie mentioned, my name is Karen, and for the past 4 to 5 years, I've been leading the Canadian Women's Foundation's efforts to put an intersectional gender lens on disaster and emergency preparedness. So this is really about how we understand the differential impacts of disasters and emergencies on people with intersecting identities. And we really want that to be at the foreground of emergency management work. For those of you who don't know us, the Canadian Women's Foundation is Canada's public foundation for gender justice and equality. For over 3 decades, we have raised funds and provided grants to organizations supporting women, girls, and gender diverse people on their journeys out of violence, out of poverty, and into leadership and possibility. In addition to providing necessary funds for the women's and gender justice sector, we create partnerships and we advocate for systemic change to improve the conditions that make the programs that we fund necessary in the first place. And so that's why we connected with the Canadian Centre for Safer Communities on these issues, and why I'm so happy to be here today to launch this excellent resource. This toolkit for equitable emergency management is the result of a deep and necessary collaboration between the foundation with Alex Valoroso and Carmen O'Neill, who are experts in the disaster and emergency management field, and with the Canadian Centre for Safer Communities. We came together and we talked about the urgent need to address the hidden disproportionate and deeply harmful impacts that disasters and emergencies have on marginalized communities, particularly women, gender diverse people, and those already facing systemic oppression due to race, ability, immigration status, sexuality, age, and any other number of intersecting identities or social conditions. Disasters and emergencies are not just moments of crisis. They're inflection points that expose inequalities and make them much worse. Among many issues that we could highlight, two stand out to us in our work at the Canadian Women's Foundation: the predictable rise in gender-based violence and the overwhelming burden placed on community organizations when state responses to disasters and emergencies fall short. Globally, we know that gender-based violence spikes during disasters and emergencies. Increased stressors like housing insecurity, trauma, economic strain, increased substance use, all of these things create conditions where violence thrives. In Canada, the COVID-19 pandemic laid this reality bare, and we really saw this in overwhelming service demand for community organizations serving women and girls. We saw spikes in domestic violence-related calls to police early in the pandemic. The United Nations declared a global shadow pandemic of gender-based violence that included everything from intimate partner violence to workplace and public harassment that increased, to the disproportionate targeting of Black, Indigenous, and racialized women, women with disabilities, and trans people. Time and again, when state systems falter, community organizations step up, and they are critical frontline responders, often without much recognition at all or adequate support. And we saw this firsthand in 2023 in the Northwest Territories wildfires, where YWCA Northwest Territories worked tirelessly to evacuate women and children from second stage housing, securing meal vouchers for them. They partnered with organizations in Calgary and Edmonton to meet basic needs. Also, we saw this in Labrador last year with the wildfires there. The Mokami Status of Women Council, which is a small community-based organization, they were providing wildfire-affected evacuees with the essential supplies that they needed while continuing their core work of supporting gender-based violence survivors. The community organizations that we fund have told us that too often they're not consulted when emergency plans are created. They're approached after the fact to debrief on how the disaster or the emergency was experienced in the community. They need to be at the table from the beginning because so many of the worst impacts, including lives lost, are predictable and preventable with inclusive and equitable planning. So if we're truly to address the unseen impacts of disasters, we must center those who are most vulnerable, women, gender diverse people, and those experiencing systemic discrimination and oppression in emergency planning, and ensure that the organizations serving them are properly resourced. At the Canadian Women's Foundation, we are really committed because of the people that we work most closely with, those frontline organizations. We're really committed to helping them to build their resilience. And one way that we are doing this is through our service continuity guidelines online course that Alex and Carmen also developed with us in partnership. This is a resource that is specifically designed for community organizations in Canada. And I think I saw in the pictures, Linda Kasawan from Scarborough Women's Centre also contributed to the creation of that tool. So good to see you, Linda. Glad that you're here. This course really helps organizations identify their critical functions and develop plans to fortify them in the face of a disaster or emergency. And we'll make sure that the link to that online course gets to you in the follow-up email from this webinar, in case there are community organizations on the call today that would benefit from it. But that's not what we're here to launch today. Today, we are really excited to launch a new tool, something that Alex and Carmen have designed specifically to support the work of emergency managers at a local level to conduct community risk assessments with an intersectional gender lens to make sure that nobody is left behind. And you'll notice in the presentation that we sort of use some terms interchangeably. We talk about intersectional gender analysis. We shorten that to IGA sometimes. We talk about gender-based analysis plus. These are all sort of synonyms for the same idea, which is that we're looking at the work that is done with a lens of understanding how the impacts of these emergencies and disasters are different depending on who you are in your community. Before I turn it over to Alex and Carmen for our walkthrough, I'd like to acknowledge that we're in a difficult moment politically. The communities experiencing the most acute forms of exclusion, oppression, and discrimination are most certainly under threat at the moment. Work that centers gender, diversity, equity, and inclusion is being not only sidelined, but defunded in big ways in Canada and globally. And at the same time, we have a warming planet. We're feeling the effects of economic and political instability, and disasters and emergencies are ever more complex and compounded. It's more important than ever that we support each other with the knowledge, the tools, and the resources to do whatever we can to protect the lives and livelihoods of those who stand to lose the most. So this toolkit is one piece of that puzzle. It's one drop in that bucket. It's an approach that we want to share with you. And we hope that you'll be able to use this tool in whatever way you can, with whatever resources you have available to you, with whatever capacity you have. And if all it does is spark ideas for you and thinking about how you can integrate an intersectional gender lens into your work, I feel like we'll have done our job in putting that in front of you. And to look at this Zoom room and to know that there's a community of practitioners who are also really invested in this and wanting to do this work well. So we're not alone in this struggle, but it's important to name that that's the moment that we're in. It's not an easy time. So with that, I would like to turn things over to Alex and Carmen to talk to us about how they developed this tool and to provide a high-level overview of what's inside. So over to you.
Thank you very much, Karen. And thanks, folks. Thank you for joining us today for the launch of the HRVA Toolkit and Companion Guide, better known as sort of Equitable Emergency Management. I'm Alex Valarosa with Valarosa Consulting. I'm a gender equity and social inclusion specialist, and I've had the privilege of working with Karen and the Canadian Women's Foundation on previous projects focused on gender and disaster. And it's been incredible to collaborate once again on this essential resource, and I'm thrilled to be here today and to also partner with Katie and her team. For those who may not know me, my work centers on integrating intersectional analysis into emergency management and disaster risk reduction. Over the years, I've supported municipalities, emergency management professionals, NGOs, government, and the private sector in applying gender-based analysis plus or intersectional analysis to hazard risk assessments, business continuity, and disaster planning, ensuring that emergency management strategies are inclusive, equitable, and effective. So having done this work, I think it's safe to say that we all recognize how critical equity and intersectionality are in emergency planning. But applying these principles in disaster management isn't always straightforward, and there hasn't always been clear practical guidance to support that work. We'll be going into more detail about the toolkit, but I wanted to emphasize that this project isn't about reinventing HRVAs. It's about strengthening them. It ensures that risk assessments go beyond identifying hazards to also capture how social factors shape vulnerability and resilience. By doing so, it helps emergency management efforts better reach those most often left out of planning, ensuring more effective and equitable disaster management responses. My hope is that this toolkit becomes a go-to resource for the emergency management community, not just as a tool to help build stronger, more inclusive strategies, but also to support you in your own journey toward equitable emergency management. Together, I believe we can help shift the broader landscape of emergency management toward more equity-driven and community-informed approaches. I'll pass it over to Carmen.
Thanks. Excuse me. Thanks, Alex. Hi, everyone. So nice to see everyone on the call. I've actually watching the chat and seeing some of my old colleagues popping up. So that's great to see you. And yeah, for those who don't know me, I'm Carmen O'Neill. Yeah, I specialize, similar to Alex, in disaster and emergency management and providing that intersectional gender lens to the work. And I'm really excited about this project in particular because as an emergency manager, identifying risks and vulnerabilities to disasters is essential. And we've seen time and time again how there are differential impacts to disasters within the same communities that we support. And so I'm really excited about the launch of this toolkit. And I believe it is filling a gap in emergency management processes. And while intersectional analysis and community engagement is typically not a standard emergency management practice, we really hope that that will change, and that colleagues working in emergency management will use this tool to ensure their risk assessments are comprehensive and aim to reduce the risks to those most impacted by hazards. And so we can go to the next slide. So before we got started on the toolkit, part of this project was to do a review of the current legislation and guidance documents pertaining to emergency management throughout Canada. So we conducted this review that included reviewing emergency management legislation and guidance documents throughout the country, including 5 federal and 30 provincial and territorial legislation and guidance documents, as well as 15 emergency plans and reports throughout the country. So some of our findings, 7 provincial and territorial documents had mentioned HRVA or similar risk assessments. And I just want to note off the start that we will be referencing HRVA a lot, or hazard risk and vulnerability assessment, for those not familiar with that acronym. But we do recognize that not all communities call this the same thing. Some people may call it hazard identification and risk assessment, or just risk assessment, or disaster risk assessment, or something similar. And so when we mention HRVA, we are including these and other similar processes. So out of the 7 provincial and territorial documents that mentioned HRVAs or similar, 2 did not mention vulnerability at all. And out of the ones that did, there was either no mention of what constitutes vulnerability or how to assess it, or the focus was on physical vulnerability, for example, looking at infrastructure vulnerability. Social vulnerability was only mentioned in 3 of the provincial or territorial legislation documents reviewed, and community engagement was only mentioned in 1. So the overarching results of this review revealed a clear gap in guidance on HRVAs or similar planning processes for local authorities and communities throughout Canada. And there were some indications and recognition of social vulnerability within federal emergency management frameworks, such as the Emergency Management Framework for Canada. The majority of provincial and territorial policies and legislation severely lacked this perspective. And this highlighted a significant opportunity for advancement in ensuring more inclusive and effective emergency management practices to enhance overall resilience to disasters, which sort of leads us into the toolkit. So you can go to the next slide.
Thanks, Carmen. So a central component of this project was ensuring that the toolkit was informed by a broad range of perspectives, not just professionals working in emergency management, but also those who work in partnership with the EM community or emergency management community, including those with lived experience and those who could speak to key sector gaps. The Sector Advisory Committee, or SAC, consisted of 24 individuals from across local authorities, emergency management, NGOs, government, and community-based organizations. Some members also had expertise in policy, resilience planning, public safety, and equity-focused initiatives. We also made a conscious effort to ensure regional diversity with members from across Canada representing urban, rural, and remote areas, so that the toolkit would be relevant in different community contexts. The SAC played a hands-on role in shaping this resource. They reviewed drafts, identified barriers to inclusive HRVAs, tested concepts, and ensured that the final toolkit would be practical and applicable. We engaged with the SAC through 3 virtual meetings held between February and June, along with ongoing collaboration via email and shared documents. This approach allowed for continuous input and refinement throughout the project. Alongside SAC engagement, we conducted a Canada-wide survey open to the broader emergency management community to gather sector-wide insights on both HRVAs and the application of GBA Plus. or intersectional analysis. We had 52 respondents in total with representation from across a large portion of Canada. While we were able to gather valuable input, we recognize that some regions are not represented, including Newfoundland and Labrador, Nunavut, PEI, and participants from traditional territories. Despite some of these gaps, the survey still provided key insights into common challenges and opportunities for integrating intersectional analysis into HRVAs. The survey helped us better understand how HRVAs are currently used and the challenges in implementation, the level of awareness and application of GBA Plus in risk assessment, barriers to equitable and inclusive HRVA planning, and what supports and resources were needed to strengthen HRVAs. Before launching the survey, subject matter experts test ran the questions, ensuring they were clear, relevant, and applicable across different emergency management settings and for communities and practitioners. Findings reinforce the key themes identified by the SAC, including limited awareness and training on HRVAs and intersectional analysis, a lack of clarity and consistency in HRV processes and guidance, making it difficult for some communities to effectively implement them. So this does not mean that we advocate for a single standardized process, but rather that clear guidance is needed to help practitioners apply HRVAs more effectively, more inclusive HRVAs effectively. There are also barriers to meaningful community engagement in HRVA development, particularly ensuring diverse voices are included in risk assessments, and challenges in turning HRVA findings into actionable policies and plans, where results were gathered but not always integrated into decision making. The survey allowed us to move beyond the perspectives of the SAC and capture broader sector trends. This ensured that the toolkit reflects the real-world experiences of emergency management practitioners and not just theoretical concepts. By grounding this work in engagement and collaboration, we hope that we created a toolkit that's adaptable, actionable, and relevant to a variety of emergency management settings. Next slide.
Hi, everyone. So this is the little screenshot of what the website looks like, where you can access the documents. Karen, is it okay if I just take control just to share the screen? Great. Didn't want to bump you. And so this is, if you go to our website, which Katie, if you could just pop the link in the chat, that would be great, just in case anyone wants to go and check it out. You go into resources and we've got a nice handy dandy little tab there for you guys to find the information. You'll see a lovely kind of introduction, which you're getting from this presentation today, but just a little bit of a breakdown. And you'll be able to access the toolkit here, the companion guide, and all the appendices. With just a click, it should load it up for you, and you can scroll through easily. We will, just for reference for everybody, it will be translated as well, and we'll have the French documentation available for everyone soon. But currently it is live for all the English resources. So yeah, simple, easy. We tried to make it as easy as possible for everybody. Sorry, Karen, now you gotta set yourself up again.
All good. Is everyone seeing my slides now? That's good. Let's see here. Is it working well? Somebody can give me a thumbs up.
We can see the slides, but they're in your window. They're not in presentation view.
Okay. Let's see here. Apologies, friends. I'm going to try that again.
get to see everyone's faces this way, though, a little briefly, see everyone who's here.
While you're doing that, Karen, there was a question in the comments. Someone just asked about the results of the research and if there was an intention to share kind of what happened. I don't know if maybe the consultants want to speak to that real quick while you're doing that.
I think that would maybe be a question for Karen, actually, because that's not owned by us. Yeah.
Sorry, I missed the question. Is it about sharing the research?
Yes.
Yes, we can absolutely make sure that you get access to that following the webinar. When we send our follow-up email, we'll make sure that that you have it. All right,
Perfect.
I think we're set now. I think I've got it.
Yes,
Thanks
you're
for
good,
bearing-
Karen. We got it. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Karen and Jade. Okay, so the toolkit, or the resource was developed to be 2 separate documents. And so we have the main toolkit and a companion guide that has templates and resources to support your HRVA process. And before we dive into the resource, I'd like to note that this toolkit is not a guide as to how to conduct an HRVA, nor is it meant to replace any current HRVA guidance documents that you may already have. Rather, it's meant to complement existing resources to help local authorities apply intersectional gender analysis to their HRVA process. And recognizing that intersectional gender analysis and examining how social identities shape hazard impacts may be completely unfamiliar or even challenging for most in this sector. However, this toolkit is meant to help and bridge that gap between emergency management and intersectional analysis, understanding that we're not experts in this area, nor do we need to be. But it provides practical tips and guidance to help those working in emergency management to develop a deeper understanding of how various social identities intersect and influence experiences and impacts to hazards, so that our emergency management programs help to reduce risk and build resilience for all. And we're not going to present the entire toolkit today because that would take too long, but we will show sections to demonstrate how these 2 documents work together and to give a good sense as to what to expect and how this will be useful to those working in emergency management at the local level. And you can go to the next slide.
Thanks, Carmen. So I'll just introduce the structure of the toolkit without going into too much detail, as we'll be covering that in the next few slides. So we identified the basic process of an HRVA and integrated an intersectional approach into each stage of the process. While the content and length will vary across different sections, each stage of the HRVA process follows the same setup to make it easy to navigate. Each section includes the stage of the HRVA process clearly outlined. Then we have intersectional gender analysis in action, how that stage changes when we apply an intersectional lens. Key questions to consider are designed to help you think critically about equity and inclusion at that stage. A getting started section with practical steps to help you begin applying these concepts, and then links to relevant appendices in the companion guide where you can find additional resources, including templates to support implementation. We'll go through an example to demonstrate what this looks like in practice, and this will give you a clear idea of how to apply the toolkit in your own work and to use it to strengthen your HRVA process. Next slide.
Okay, so as Alex had already mentioned, we sort of pulled out the key sort of steps that you would typically do in a HRVA or similar risk assessment process. And for the purpose of today, we're highlighting the hazard identification step. And so you'll see at the beginning of each section in the toolkit that we start with an explanation or description of the step. So for example, hazard identification is the process of identifying the hazards specific to your community. And so you'll see a description there. We then go into an explanation as to how to incorporate intersectional gender analysis into that step. And so each step throughout the toolkit will have an intersectional analysis and action section that will guide you into how to incorporate intersectional analysis into that particular step in the HRVA process. And I know that we briefly mentioned already what we mean by intersectional gender analysis, but for those who aren't really familiar with that term, just to sort of reiterate, But it's essentially an equity-based framework, usually utilized in policy or plan development and decision-making processes. And it essentially helps us to consider the intersecting social identities, such as sex, gender, age, race, excuse me, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, and other factors, and how they shape experiences and opportunities for people. And so using intersectional gender analysis helps us to create plans and make decisions that consider the experiences and needs of those that the plans impact. And so by using an intersectional analysis in emergency management, we can ensure our plans are considering the diverse needs and experiences of the communities that are most impacted by disasters. And so regarding hazard identification, you might be thinking, I know the hazards that my community experiences. Why do I need an intersectional analysis for this? And as you can see in the intersectional analysis in action section on the screen, we've highlighted community engagement and data collection as the intersectional analysis in action for this step. So intersectional analysis in action in this context is looking at who is involved in the hazard identification process and how data on hazard identification is collected and verified. Now, I won't go into each of those two components too much in detail for now, for time's sake, but we do have two main sections on data collection and community engagement that are extremely important and can feed into all other steps of your HRVA process. So I highly recommend that if you're gonna use this toolkit, that you take a deep dive into those sections. But just to summarize, it's very important to engage the community in hazard identification and through all your steps of doing your HRVA. And not doing so could leave out essential information on the potential hazards in your community. Residents possess invaluable insights into their environment, including knowledge on historical events, seasonal changes, and areas prone to hazards that may not be apparent to everyone, including the local authority. And there are other benefits as well, such as community participation in hazard identification can raise community awareness, fostering a sense of ownership and responsibility for their own preparedness, and can build trust between communities and local authorities, which can improve communication and cooperation during emergencies. And so not to oversimplify intersectional analysis at all, but some people may even be doing this work without realizing it. Yeah, and you can go to the next slide.
Thanks, Carmen. So for stage 4, hazard identification, the questions to consider are designed to help practitioners apply this intersectional lens to the process. These questions are meant to be exhaustive. They're guiding prompts to help frame discussions with your team. The idea is to challenge assumptions, uncover gaps, and bring in different perspectives that might otherwise be overlooked when identifying hazards or whatever HRVA stage you're working on. For stage 4 specifically, the goal is to move beyond traditional risk assessments that focus only on physical hazards and instead capture the full picture of vulnerability and resilience. There are also additional questions in the appendices that dive deeper into hazard identification, so be sure to check those out if you need further guidance. And each section is built like this, where you're going to have your key questions to consider for every process of the HRVA. Next slide.
Okay, getting started. So each stage of the HRVA will have a getting started section to help guide you as what to do to get started on that step. It's essentially a simplified checklist with tips on starting the process. It's outlined in the same way throughout each section of the toolkit. So as you go through each step, you will see this same getting started checklist. And then as you can see on the slide, there is an example for this, for the hazard identification step. And so, yeah, first step for hazard identification, you might want to start by researching the history of hazards in your community, looking at past events and their impacts, etc. And then as you can see, community engagement is a key piece of that as well, consulting with Indigenous communities, and it's advised to form a steering committee or an advisory committee that's composed of diverse community members to advise on the process as well. And then every getting started section should also have a link to a template that will help to start the process as well. So you can click on the link and use the template. If you already have your own template in your own community already, then you don't need to use this one, but it is just there as a resource for those who can find it useful. And so you can go to the next slide.
So as mentioned before, the companion guide is not a standalone document, but rather a resource that complements the toolkit. It provides additional context, background, and deeper dives into key concepts that can support your work. We'll be going through the guide shortly, so for now, I'll just share a high-level overview of what's inside. So the companion guide includes background on the project, the business case or making a case for intersectional gender analysis, and guidance on how to use both the toolkit and companion guide effectively. It provides a deeper dive into intersectional gender analysis in GBA Plus, explaining why these approaches are critical for ensuring HRVAs are inclusive and effective. There are templates, tools, and additional resources to help put this work into practice. And the appendices contains checklists and additional guiding questions, making it easy to find practical, ready-to-use tools. You don't need to read this cover to cover. It's quite a lengthy document with all the appendices, but it's designed to be a flexible reference tool. Essentially, if you're looking for a deeper explanation of a concept or more detailed templates, you'll find it here in the companion guide. Next slide, please.
Great. So in the part 1 of the companion guide, excuse me, we provide an overview of what to expect from both the guide and the toolkit, including how to use the toolkit. So this section provides an introduction and overview of the resource and the background to the project, including the business case for intersectional gender analysis. And it sets the stage for understanding the purpose, objectives, and scope of the work, offering more context for the next sections as needed. It also provides a roadmap to guide you through the toolkit with some recommended steps to take for those who may find that helpful as you get started on your hazard, risk, and vulnerability assessment. And you can go to the next slide.
So in this section, so what we heard from the emergency management community is that while there's recognition of the importance of taking an intersectional approach, practitioners weren't always supported in doing so. There are many barriers, from limited resources and competing priorities to opposition or concerns about what this shift means in practice. That's why making the case was developed, to help address some of the key challenges and concerns. We know that people are busy and that those with decision-making power and authority may not take the time to read through all of this work. And so by providing a structured case for why integrating intersectional gender analysis into HRVAs makes sense, we hope this can serve as a tool not only to support emergency management professionals in making the case for better resources and institutional support, but also demonstrates the practical benefits of this approach in strengthening emergency planning. At the very least, it provides a starting point for conversation for those who are interested in beginning this work. To make the case clear and actionable, we structured it into a one-pager. It's a table that outlines the key strategic objectives of integrating intersectional analysis into HRVAs, the core feature of that objective, so what it looks like in practice, and the expected outcomes and benefits for emergency management and communities. This can be presented to decision makers to help move your case for intersectional analysis forward. The case for integrating an intersectional approach into HRVAs is both strategic and practical. So by embedding IGA into emergency management, we're not just adding another layer. We're strengthening risk assessments, making emergency planning more effective, and improving outcomes for communities, particularly those that are most marginalized during disasters. Next slide, please.
Great. And so part 2 of the companion guide. In this section, we provide an overview of what is an HRVA. What do we mean by hazard, risk, and vulnerability assessment for those less familiar with it and its process, and why an HRVA or similar is important, and also how you can use it. So it goes over ways that it can be used, including emergency planning, municipal planning and development, community and recreation plans, social service programs, and infrastructure planning. We also go over what is intersectional gender analysis and why it is important in an HRVA. And just to reiterate, and I know we've sort of pressed this hard, but intersectional analysis is vital in emergency management because it can provide you with a comprehensive understanding of how and why emergencies impact diverse populations differently, and can help us develop risk reduction strategies that can ideally reduce risks for those who are impacted the most. And we can't reduce the risks of those who are impacted the most without knowing who is impacted most and why. And some sections of this companion guide, or of this part of the companion guide, may not be relevant for you. For example, if you already are familiar with what an HRV is or what intersectional gender analysis is, you can skip these sections, but we wanted to include them for those who are less familiar with it. And you can go to the next slide.
Great. So the final section of the companion guide is part 3, resources and appendices. This section isn't, again, not meant to be read front to back, but rather serves as a reference library of tools, templates, and additional resources to support you in your work. It includes guiding questions and checklists to help apply IGA throughout the HRVA process. The questions to consider are generally set up with a key focus area or theme. I believe you'll see this on your screen, followed by questions designed to help identify important insights or gaps. In the slide, you'll see an example of the setup specifically focusing on questions related to data collection. It also includes templates and worksheets that provide a structured format to help teams document key considerations at each stage of the HRVA. To make these tools more practical, we've included an example scenario that runs throughout the templates to demonstrate how they can be applied in practice. The appendices were developed to be practical and easy to use rather than overwhelming. Since each appendix is meant to be used as a takeaway resource, there may be some overlap in the guiding questions across different sections. This is intentional as the questions are meant to serve, again, as guiding prompts that can be revisited at different points in the process. And if you're looking for step-by-step support, you'll find checklists and templates that can be adapted to fit your needs. And lastly, if you need additional references or data sources, the appendices provides links to existing research, best practices, and sector tools. Next slide.
Okay, so I think we can go to questions now.